and he had to give the order fire, and he wrote home to his family that that was the worst thing that he ever had to do. Another relative of his, Andrew Jackson Clark, also in Company D of the 2nd Wisconsin Cavalry, and so he is actually wearing a mounted services jacket, which is the second jacket from the right out of those uniforms, and the yellow is the cavalry trim that he would have been wearing. Other trim colors would be red for artillery, and then before the Civil War it would be orange for dragoons and green for mounted rifles. So also in 1862, another unit that was recruited out of Osceola were part of the 10th Wisconsin Light Artillery Battery, and the highest ranking among those men was Second Lieutenant Oscar Allen Clark, seen here. And actually on his shoulder boards you can see they've been colored in red because that would be the branch insignia for artillery. So these shoulder boards here, these would be for a cavalry second lieutenant, and his are the same, just that they have red. So these would be an artillery sergeant's chevrons. Another Osceola resident, Dr. Carmen Porter Garlick, just like Dr. Smith from Taylor's Falls, Dr. Garlick had set up practice in this area, and so he was called to serve as a surgeon in the 14th and then the 35th Wisconsin Infantry, and served throughout the war, and then he was discharged for illness, and on his way home in 1865 he died, and then his body was brought back and buried in Osceola. Another local resident, Weber Samuel Seavey, who actually traveled from Osceola to Iowa to join Company H of the 5th Iowa Cavalry, served with that unit throughout the war, and helped lead a Union cavalry charge during the Battle of Jonesboro, Georgia, during General Sherman's campaign, Atlanta campaign in 1864, and he was captured and sent to Andersonville prison, but eventually, after being held at another prison, escaped and made his way back to Union lines, and then finished out the war as captain of Company H of the 5th Iowa Cavalry. And actually after the war he became a chief of police in several cities, including Omaha, Nebraska, and he helped establish and was the first president of the International Association of Chiefs of Police. A soldier from Farmington, Wisconsin, just south of Osceola, Charles Fenlison, also in the 4th Wisconsin Infantry and Cavalry. And Seth Ayers, a soldier from Farmington, Wisconsin, in a late war regiment, the 44th Wisconsin Infantry. And Viet Geiger from Farmington, who was drafted into Company F of the 6th Wisconsin Infantry, which was part of the Iron Brigade, and he was wounded in action at the Battle of Five Forks, Virginia, at the beginning of the Appomattox campaign. And he actually built a building in downtown Osceola that he had as a brewery, and then it became the Polk County Courthouse before the county seat, moved to Balsam Lake. And then this is Samuel Harriman. He founded the town of Somerset, Wisconsin, which is in St. Croix County. And so the picture on the left is the earlier photo. That was when he started out the war as a captain in the 30th Wisconsin Infantry. He then became a colonel, the colonel and commanding officer of the 37th Wisconsin Infantry, so that's the image at right. And he led that regiment into the Eastern Theater, notably at the Battle of the Crater during the siege of Petersburg. So that battle, essentially, the Union and Confederate armies in the Eastern Theater were locked at Petersburg in a 10-month siege before Richmond, from June 1864 until April 1865. And the Battle of the Crater was July 30th, 1864. Essentially, a regiment of Pennsylvania coal miners dug a mine shaft under, between the trench lines under no man's land, packed thousands of tons of gunpowder into a magazine that they dug, and then lit a fuse and blew it up, and blew a hole in the Confederate lines and killed a couple hundred Confederate soldiers instantly. And then the Union Ninth Corps, which he served in, charged forward and tried to exploit that break, but they were eventually forced back. So it became a massive Union disaster. But then he was eventually promoted to brigade commander, so he led a brigade during the breakthrough at Petersburg, which resulted in Lee's surrender at Appomattox a week later. And so then at the end of the war, he was promoted to Brevet Brigadier General. And Joseph Stannard Baker, a post-war resident of St. Croix Falls, he essentially filled the position that Robert Murphy, who became colonel of the 8th Wisconsin, had held as manager of the Cushing Land Company. And so then the Baker family became a well-known family in that area. And his cousin, Lafayette Baker, was actually the first director of the U.S. Secret Service. And the lieutenant colonel of the 1st D.C. Cavalry was named Everton Conger. So when President Abraham Lincoln was assassinated by John Wilkes Booth on April 14th, 1865, the Secret Service, led by Joseph Baker's cousin, Lafayette Baker, tasked a couple officers in the 1st D.C. Cavalry, Lieutenant Colonel Conger and one of Baker's cousins, Luther Baker, to lead a detachment of soldiers from the 16th New York Cavalry to track down John Wilkes Booth. And one of those members of that detachment was Thomas Boston Corbett. And so this group of just a couple dozen soldiers tracked down John Wilkes Booth and his accomplice David Harold to the Garrett Farm near Port Royal, Virginia. And Booth and Harold were sleeping in the tobacco barn, and so the cavalry troopers surrounded the house and ordered Booth to surrender, but he refused to do so. So Boston Corbett actually aimed his revolver through a slat in the side of the barn and shot and mortally wounded John Wilkes Booth, who died a few hours later in Lieutenant Luther Baker's arms, the cousin of Joseph Stannard Baker. And so then after the war, Boston Corbett, who actually also spent some time in a mental asylum, he worked in the Kansas legislature actually, but he was forced out after he brandished a weapon at the legislators. And there is some evidence that he made his way to Minnesota, and it is believed that he died in the Great Hinckley Fire of 1894, which is up in Pine County. And so there was a man who died in the fire whose name was Thomas Corbett, and because this Thomas Corbett disappeared from the written record around that time, it's assumed that that was him who died in that fire. So that's another interesting local Civil War connection, that the man who killed President Lincoln's assassin probably died here in the St. Croix River Valley. So that is most of the people I was going to talk about for the presentation, but I also have a lot of uniforms and equipment here that you can feel free to come and look at. Our Confederate soldier is on your right side over here. He's wearing a Columbus Depot jacket, which was common for Confederate soldiers in the Western theater of the war, especially from 1862 onwards. So at battles like Perryville, Stones River, Chickamauga, that would be a common jacket. And just it is just differentiated because of the blue piping on the collar and on the cuffs. And then actually this cap, so you might notice that it's actually more of a green color. That's because this was the uniform color for a couple regiments. They were called Berdan's sharpshooters, the 1st and 2nd Regiment of United States Sharpshooters, and Company G was actually recruited from Wisconsin, and so the green was actually a type of camouflage. So it was essentially uniforms just like the one I'm wearing, except they were dyed green. And then also when the 1st Minnesota Infantry fought at the Battle of Gettysburg, and 8 companies of the regiment, including Company B from the Stillwater area, made their famous charge at Gettysburg. This is the insignia that they would have been wearing, so that's their corps badge. Yes, so yeah, if you have any questions, feel free, and then just feel free to also look at anything you'd like. Yes?
There's a theory, and I don't know if it's, real or not, but that the Confederacy actually instigated the war against the Dakota War, so that the Union soldiers up there would be kept in the North.
I don't know if I've heard that, but there were a lot of theories that went around like that actually during the war itself. Probably because a lot of Northerners would have, because the war was ongoing and that was the enemy in their mind, there were similar instances of Northerners worrying about sabotage in other parts of the country. So I could definitely see how that could have originated with just the fear. And yeah, there was fear here in Minnesota and all the way throughout Wisconsin. Even people on the shore of Lake Michigan were evacuating their homes in fear of the Dakota. And also in this area, there was a large fear of the Chippewa as well, known as the Ojibwe primarily today. And so there was actually a militia company organized in Osceola called the Osceola Home Guard. And they were organized as a defense just in case there was a Chippewa uprising, just like there had been with the Dakota uprising. But actually, there were at least a dozen Ojibwe men, mostly from what is now Burnett County, who were recruited in early 1864 to serve in companies F and G of the 7th Wisconsin Infantry, part of the Iron Brigade, which is actually the insignia on that hat over there. And so they served through the bloody battles in the Eastern Theater from the Wilderness, Spotsylvania, through the Siege of Petersburg. And so in Wisconsin, there were actually over 500 Native Americans who served in the Union Army out of about 80,000 Wisconsin men served, and about 22,000 Minnesotans served.